which, you know, a lot of people, especially if they're co-Masons, will know her. Amy Bothwell Goss, Mabel St. Clair Stobart, Lady Agnes Geraldine Grove, Evelina Haverford. And a lot of these women were actually involved in activism already. There was a burgeoning women's rights movement happening at that point. And a lot of them were involved in that. They were involved in, especially during the First World War, and possibly earlier, I don't know, the Boer War. They were very involved in the medical corps. And I think there was one of them who was, yes, the Honourable Evelina Haverfield. She founded the Women's Emergency Corps and the Women's Volunteer Reserve, Green Cross Corps. So that was the ambulance women, basically. They were the drivers. And yeah, I mean, they were incredible women. The majority of them were middle class, intellectual women, so your classic blue stockings. But they also had, I think, in most cases, the support of their husbands. They were quite lucky with that on all the families. Obviously, not every woman who was involved in advancing women's suffrage had that privilege to actually have someone support them. So yeah, I mean, there were some incredible women, and you know, the fact that they were drawn towards Freemasonry was actually probably quite something that would progress quite naturally, because of the, you know, the whole thing of wanting to advance humankind, not just men, but also women, you know, the whole thing of equality, charity, and brotherly love. So I think that was a big part of it.
Well, it kind of fits, doesn't it, when you talk about their background and their partners, but not everybody was lucky enough to have a partner like that. But when you, out of those names you've mentioned, were there any Freemasons and suffragettes who really stood out for you? Fangirl moments, if you will.
Yeah, I think for me, it was probably, well, Annie Besant is really interesting because she was involved in so many things, and she's actually really well known for her kind of parallel membership of things like the Theosophy Society, and her humanitarian work. I mean, she was a big activist. Maria de Reims, probably because she was the first well-known woman Freemason. Obviously, that happened in France. But I don't know. I mean, I think, to be honest, they had guts to actually do that in the era, because, I mean, you could be, like, having said earlier about the fact that, you know, they were so restricted and oppressed, they had the guts to actually go out there and rebel, but at least they rebelled in a kind of like constructive way. I mean, even actresses in those days were seen as immoral. I mean, they were pretty much kind of put on the same level as prostitutes. You know, it really was that kind of looked down on, to step out of the sphere. So, you know, the fact that they were out not only sort of like working with prostitutes, you know, and working with women who were suffering domestic violence, getting their hands dirty, going to war. It was a really powerful time. And I think, you know, Freemasonry has always been a very evolving society, and it, for want of, you know, not wanting to bring in politics or anything like that particularly, but the women involved, and a lot of the men who were involved in Freemasonry at the time, were very much into the growing political aspects of furthering women's rights and women's suffrage. So it all, it kind of all blends in quite nicely.
Well, let's look in a bit more detail of that blending. So why do you think so many suffragettes decided to investigate Freemasonry and connect themselves with it? What do you think it was that enabled them to do that?
Well,
made them want to do that?
I think they would have been drawn to the ethics and ideology of it. Again, the premise of everyone being equal, this, well, I mean, it was basically the co-masons or the adoptive lodges who championed women most, and they were actually quite vocal about really standing up for when these women actually went out there and did the activism. I mean, that this activism was not always peaceful by a long shot. And, they ended up in prison, and they were force-fed. There was cases of, women actually being killed. The main one that we know of was the woman that kind of went under the racehorse. And I think the very fact that they wanted to be part of society, they wanted to be part of a society as well, with like-minded people, birds of a feather flock together. And I think they found kindred spirits within Freemasonry, whether that was, that they had partners, husbands that were in Freemasonry itself, or that they went outside the box of UGLE and joined the adoptive lodges and co-masonry.
Well, let's talk about that, actually, Philippa. Let's talk about the lodges they were part of in those very early days. Adopted lodges, for example, traveling to France to be initiated. Let's talk about the lodges they were part of. And did you notice what I did there? Gave you an opportunity to grab some water.
Okay, so to begin with, it would have been the adoptive lodges in France. Now, adoptive lodges were actually usually adjoined to a male-only lodge, but it was encouraged to allow women to be part of it. Quite often the rituals wouldn't have actually been mixed at that particular time. And obviously, when I wrote The Masonic Magician, I learned quite a bit about adoptive lodges, because Cagliostro's Egyptian Rite was an adoptive lodge. So it allowed women to take the chair within that aspect of it. It allowed women to become the Grand Mistress of the lodge. And in France, they were under the Grand Orient de France. And I think effectively for each female officer, there was a male counterpart. So it was this kind of a very close relationship, still keeping them kind of under the wing.
Yes.
A little bit.
Keeping an eye on them.
But not the thumb, know. So basically, Maria de Reims, I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, but I think it's right. She was actually a very prominent activist and very highly educated, an author. And she was initiated into a French lodge in 1882. And it was interesting because at her initiation, the master of this lodge, he actually said, "We're about to consecrate one of the greatest humanitarian principles, that of equality. By admitting a woman into our mysteries, we proclaim the equality of the two human beings who together incur in the propagation of the human race."
Wow.
So that is, and then he says, to do away with her prejudices by the moral teachers in the light of Masonry would be to bring about by peaceful means true social emancipation. Now, for 1882, that was brilliant. A year later, de Reims and Georges Martin, who was a founder member of the GLSC, they founded the first mixed sex lodge, which became Le Droit Humain, which, as most people know, or those who are aware of it, was pretty much the first co-Masonic lodge. So Maria is very a powerful woman. And so women in England got to know about this. Annie Besant, and who was also, again, a radical feminist. She was a theosophist. She took this opportunity to take, I think they went with 6 friends, including, feminist suffragettes. And they traveled to Paris, and they were initiated, passed and raised in the first 3 degrees. So, but then on her return to London, she then integrated it into British society. And they started the first Ladroit Humane Lodge over in England. And that was number 6, Human Duty. And that was consecrated in 1902. And Besant actually remained the leader of the order until she died in 1933.
Well, let's talk about, Philippa, can we talk about the splits that happened? Because a couple of interesting splits that happened. So let's talk about the first split that occurred. Tell me more about that.
Well, there was a split that happened in France, but then the 2 schisms that happened in England were basically around 1908. Some members of the co-masonry wanted to distance themselves from some aspects of the sort of French mixed Masons and conform more to the Freemasonry of UGLE. So they formed a new Grand Lodge, which they called the Honourable Fraternity of Ancient Masonry, or HFAM, founded 20th June 1908. A guy called Reverend William Cobb, he took the role of Grand Master. Again, we're still seeing this thing where there needed to be a man present. And he became, he was Grand Master and Worshipful Master of Lodge Golden Rule number 1. And when they consecrated, he actually said that the draft Declaration of Principles states that the aims of the new fraternity were briefly, 1, to spiritualize Masonry, and 2, to give women their proper place in the brotherhood of Masonry. Boom. So he was very, very instrumental in furthering this. And he believed that having women in Freemason was a restitution of their rights, and that an organization that prohibits women from participating in the mysteries is contradictory in its profession of universal brotherhood, a brotherhood that excludes an entire gender. Now, of course, obviously that is still something of contention, because Anderson's constitutions prescribe women from being part of regular Freemasonry. So he hovered in both kind of camps there. In 1912, he resigned, giving women a proper place in the Brotherhood of Masonry, and Marion Halsey was appointed Grand Master. And then since 1912, all the Grand Masters of HFAM have been women, and the order became exclusively female in 1935. The second schism was basically to do with the Holy Royal Arch. And in 1913, similar to the situation with the Ancients and Moderns in the Union, another split happened. So those members who wished to include the Royal Arch broke away to form the Honourable Fraternity of Ancient Freemasons, or HFAF. And just like the Ancients and Moderns, there were 2 Grand Lodges in parallel that were women-based. So to avoid the confusion between the 2 orders, in 1958, HFAM added Order of Women's Freemasons to the title, which is how we know them now, OWF.
Yes.
So
brings us to where we are now. Now, Philippa, I have learned so much in the last, how long have we been talking? Nearly 25 minutes or so. But I will go to the chat screen, because many a Mason and many of our audience would like me to put a question to you. This is an interesting one, actually. Keith Roberts, nice to hear from you. He says, do you think that suffragettes' beliefs can be applied to our lives today? What do you think?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, we're in an interesting position at the moment with women's rights. We are kind of having to sort of step aside a little bit for certain things. And for a lot of women, this feels like going backwards. I don't think it's a particularly good place for us to be at the moment. And I really hope it resolves itself and we kind of go back to the natural order of where we were. I think women are actually being incredibly tolerant at the moment about various things, and we don't see the kind of protests that were happening with suffragettes. I mean, we have brilliant rights in many aspects, so we really don't want to lose those. And I think it's very important that we do keep standing up. And it's lucky that we do have a lot of men that are willing to stand up and kind of, you know, support things as they are today. But yes, I can actually see there is a parallel starting again. It's almost like these things go in cycles.
Yeah, they go around in circles, don't they, really? Yeah. Keith, thank you for that really good question. Keep those coming in, ladies and gentlemen and brethren. Let's talk about men. Who were the male Freemasons who had a role in women's rights, Philippa? Because there might be a few people watching this who are quite surprised by that.
Oh, yeah. There were some very prominent Freemasons. Richard Pankhurst, who, for those of you who know something about suffragettes, that surname will ring a bell. I'll get to that in a minute. He was actually, he was in Manchester, St. George Lodge number 1170 in 1867. So yeah, this is a long time ago. And he actually established a National Society for Women's Suffrage. He drafted the Women's Disabilities Removal Bill, which was the first suffrage bill in England, author of the bill which became the Married Women's Property Act. So there we have that brought into it, which actually gave wives absolute control over their property and earnings. He was the husband of Emmeline Pankhurst, who was one of the most prominent women's rights activists and suffragettes. I mean, she was absolutely pivotal in this movement that went from, you know, women just kind of like, oh God, we've had enough, we need to do something, to it being militant. You know, her daughter, or their daughters rather, Christabel, Sylvia and Adela, which are three massive kind of players in the suffragette movements. So that was pretty amazing. They were also involved in various other political movements as well, which was advancing at the time. Then another really interesting one was Maharaja Duleep Singh. He had come over to the UK and he was the exiled Maharaja. This was in 1861. And he then went back to India for a while, and he was admitted into Freemasonry and Lodge Star in the East, Calcutta, number 67. Aside from his very interesting life, which I actually wrote an article about for Freemasonry Today. His daughter Sophia was one of several Indian women who were prominent suffragettes.
Wow.
And yeah, there was actually a really interesting cluster of women, Indian women, who were doing this as well. And she actually carried on with her work until her death in 1948. So that took some doing. Then you got William Cobb, who I mentioned earlier, who was part of the French mixed masonry. So they were, you know, really high up and well-respected men. And that just goes to show that, you know, when you, God, this is going to sound awful. I was going to say, when you've got the support of men, you can do. No,
but I know what you're saying, because I've got to be honest, Philippa. I mean, we're not comparing to what the suffragettes went through, but the men, they must have had some flack as well getting involved in this. What do you think?
Oh, I would absolutely imagine so. I mean, to be honest, in my research, I haven't found an awful lot of you know, sort of evidence for that I can bring up now. But yes, I would imagine that there was a lot of harumphing and kind of possibly, you know, blackballing could have been going on, you know, with this kind of stuff. So yeah, to stick your neck out like that, not only in Victorian society or Edwardian society, but also within Freemasonry, which of course was very male orientated at that point. Another guy is Richard Sankey, but we'll get on to him in a bit, I believe, because
absolutely.
He's the man.
Yes, he is. Now, Steve has been in touch. Hello, Steve Homewood. He said, "What happened to the male members in 1935? Were they asked to resign? How did they part the waves there?"
I think they actually started leaving. I think they stopped men visiting sort of between when Cobb resigned and the sort of early 1920s. It was gradually phased out. And I think once the remaining members had either passed or had left, it became predominantly female, which, you know, is it was pretty pivotal moment for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let's talk about the role of Theosophy now. How did this connect with the philosophical aspects of Freemasonry? Because this, as we've alluded to, this all kind of went hand in hand, didn't it?
Yeah, Theosophy under the Theosophical Society was actually, or well, it still is, it was classed as an esoteric new religious movement. And it kind of like incorporated aspects of Western esotericism, also Eastern religions. So you got Hinduism, Buddhism, bit of Islam. So it's kind of like a bit of a melting pot of traditions. It was actually founded in New York City in 1875. So kind of around about the time that the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and those offshoots were around. Now, women were actually finding kind of refuge in these groups because obviously they believed in equality for females. And also, I think with Theosophy, the principal tenet apparently, I think, was to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. So pretty much aligned with, you know, the basic philosophy behind Freemasonry. Add in the spiritual stuff, and it was kind of like the perfect environment for these women to be able to get into.
Yeah, it's like the planets were perfectly aligned in that case, wasn't it? So yeah. Let's talk about a very, very famous gentleman. What legal change did they manage to achieve, would you say, and with a little bit of support?
Oh, well, I think obviously Pankhurst, he was creating a pathway for women to be able to move forward with suffrage and women's rights. So, I mean, obviously that wasn't so much connected with his Freemasonry. He did that anyway. But the very fact that, you know, he was actually living the principles of Freemasonry in his everyday life, which, you know, is obviously one of the main things that Freemasonry espouses to try and instill in people, is to take it outside the lodge as well. And he did that. But John Sankey, who was Viscount Sankey, was the guy that made history. This guy is my hero in a lot of respects.
I can see you've lit up whilst talking about him, actually, because he's a very special man, isn't he?
Yeah, he was a senior Freemason. He was a lawyer, judge, Labour politician, and Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain. After passing the bar, he actually joined Freemasonry, and he became a very active Freemason. His original lodge was Prince Llewellyn Lodge number 2570, 1897, and he was 30 at the time. And then he kind of went on and he founded or co-founded several lodges. So this was a very important part of his life. And he then was brought in, well, actually, a couple of his judgments have become landmark statements of law. And there was one called Edwards versus Canada, referred to as the Persons case. And this actually dealt with the eligibility of women to be appointed to the Canadian Senate. Now, the backstory behind that is that in 1916, a group of women who were led by an activist, Emily Murphy, attempted to attend a trial of Alberta women accused of prostitution. They were removed from the courtroom on the grounds that the testimony was not fit for mixed company. So they were furious, and they said, if the evidence is not fit to be heard in mixed company, then the government must set up a special court presided over by women to try other women. Amazingly, they agreed and appointed her as magistrate. However, on day one of her authority to preside as a judge, she was challenged by a lawyer. His argument is that women were not considered to be persons under the British North America Act. So basically, this continued on the grounds that women were not persons in law. I mean, how can we even say that? And, you know, this was 1917, for goodness sake. So a petition was created, signed by nearly 500,000 Canadians, who asked that she be appointed to the Senate. So the women who kind of got together to do this were known as the famous five, or the valiant five. And it was just extraordinary. You know, I mean, when you're having to fight for over these kind of definitions, and you know, it's a bit like, again, today we're having to fight for certain definitions. Basically, it was unbelievable. So it was actually Sankey who ruled that, of course, women were female persons, because it said, does the word persons in this particular act include female persons? In 1928, the Supreme Court unanimously held that women were not qualified persons. But then Sankey, who in writing for the committee found the meaning of qualified persons could be read broadly to include women, thus reversing the decision. So he said the exclusion of women from all public offices is a relic of days more barbarous than ours, and that to those who ask why the word person should include females, the obvious answer is, why should it not? Wow. So this was like an absolute victorious moment when women became persons.
So John Sankey, first Viscount Sankey, we owe him, don't we? And I think we all owe him a lot for that. Back to the chat screen. Time is running out, Philip. I've just looked at the time. We've only got a few minutes left. Sorry. So apologies if I can't get to as many questions as I normally would, but this is such an engaging conversation. Dudley Tucker has been in touch. Now, we're talking about suffragettes and Freemasonry, but Dudley says, was Florence Nightingale a Freemason? And are you aware there is a lodge in London named after her?
As far as I'm aware, she wasn't a Freemason. I may be completely wrong on this. Feel free to correct me. But she was pretty much within the category of being an enormous kind of forward-thinking woman within within the women's rights movement. All of these women were pretty much classed as being neurotic, you know, the usual kind of rubbish. But they went out and they did it. So, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, she's obviously got a huge reputation. Yeah, it's just, do you know, actually, I'll just quickly put this in. One event which happened was the women's coronation procession. This was the first time that women were seen wearing Masonic regalia, and it was to do with the coronation of King George V, and it was a massive suffragette rally, and they had their anthem, March of the Women, you know, and they had 45 contingents making this up, including the Indian Women's Delegation, Ledroit Humane, and a mixture, and apparently Annie Besant in full Masonic regalia was resplendent and bareheaded in a yellow silk sari. And she was accompanied by Emily Lutyens, who was also co-mason. But I mean, can you imagine how cool that must have been, seeing these women all parading, thousands, hundreds, thousands of them.
Yeah, it's an amazing moment and a powerful moment as well.
Yeah.
Philippa, our time here is nearly done. I've got time to ask you a couple more questions. Apologies, ladies and gentlemen and brethren. That's how we roll with Solomon Live. They go in the blink of an eye. When you think about the suffragettes and the connection with Freemasonry, how proud does it make you feel with the research that you've done over many years?
Incredibly. Like I said, it was a very, very difficult time that they were living in, and to actually not only, politically for women's rights, but they got into Freemasonry. Oh, probably shouldn't say that, but I think it was an extraordinary time. Freemasonry has always been such an inspiring and motivational and good force, and this whole kind of subject pretty much embodies that. And they worked on both sides. You had got these guys working with them, which was absolutely fantastic. So it is a subject that is definitely worth looking into more, because it's just like goes on and it's fascinating, and the women were just like incredible, and their lives aside from their Freemasonry were absolutely brilliant. But also, if you look into what they did in the lodges at the time as well, it's just great. I love it.
Incredible. And to call them a pioneer, that's a big understatement as well, isn't it? Philippa, how can someone find out more about Freemasonry and the suffragettes and you, if they're inspired to do so after our conversation today?
What I really want to mention is, if I hadn't have had this incredible resource, Anne Pilcher Dayton, she wrote her PhD thesis, Women Freemasons and Feminist Causes, 1935, the case of the Honourable Fraternity of Ancient Masonry. She's also written The Open Door, the Order of Women's Freemasons. If you want really in-depth knowledge on this, she is brilliant, absolutely stunning. So from that point of view, I am so grateful that I was able to utilise that. If you want to find out more about what I've written, there's a 4-part series on the Square magazine, Freemasonry and Women's Rights. So hop over to the Square, not just for that, obviously, but, for just fantastic, advancement of Masonic knowledge, all on one website.
Yeah, exactly what this is about.
Also,
have you enjoyed?
Website, so just Google me.
I do no time at all. Have you enjoyed your Solomon Live experience?
Sorry?
Have you enjoyed your Solomon Live experience?
I have. It's been really lovely. And you are such a brilliant host. And I'm so grateful to you all for actually considering me to come and waffle on at you for 45 minutes. And
no, not at all. I've been literally hanging off your every word. In typical fashion, we could have talked for spoken for another half an hour, maybe even longer. Ladies and gentlemen and brethren, thank you ever so much indeed for joining us this evening. And before I disappear into the warm evening, a few things to mention. Our next Solomon Live will be Tuesday, the 4th of July, where our topic will be Freemasonry and the Foundation of the USA. This is brilliant. 4th of July. I don't think that was a coincidence. And we're going to be meeting Most Worshipful Brother Akram Elias, past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Washington, D.C., and discussing the significance of the 1723 constitutions to the founding fathers during the formation of the United States of America. So what's really quite funny about that is we're going to be having our special guest in London for that, and our very special guest this evening is in America at the moment. So there you go. So that's going to be Tuesday, the 4th of July, 7:30. We won't let you forget it. And if you haven't done so already, please register for Solomon. You'll find us in no time at all, solomon.ugle.org.uk, full of useful and fantastic content for your daily advancement in Masonic knowledge. Until then, thank you for joining us this evening, and we'll see you back here very, very soon. Good night, everybody.